Episode 2 of Ask Coach Nate. In this one, we're going to focus on planning your winter training. Nate thought that it would be great if we went into more on how to incorporate strength, endurance, aerobic conditioning, like all the things that you need to focus on in winter in order to be fit and race ready for spring and summer. So we'll ask a few questions and Nate, get his perspective on like what he does, what maybe a pro would do, and then try to take what we can learn from that and apply it to people like me who had no pro career, have no hope of ever being a pro, but love to race, love to ride, want to be fit, want to be strong, and want to hopefully go for some top 10 KOM. So Nate, when people are thinking about scheduling, planning, and the progression in their training over winter, what does an ideal training week look for someone like you or someone who's a professional cyclist over this type of season?
Yeah, I mean, usually if racing in California would wrap up like in September or so, I might tone it down and just kind of ride for fun and like just stay active and maybe start running a little bit in October. But usually by November, I would start ramping up. And from November through like February or March, I would focus on building like volume, aerobic conditioning, so like sub threshold, like high aerobic efforts, and strength. And that would usually look like early on, it would be a little bit less intense. Later on, it would be a little bit more intense. And it would mostly increase in difficulty by the quantity of work done below threshold. So like early on, maybe I would do some like 10, 20 minute like tempo efforts. So for me, that's like, let's say 350, because let's say my threshold is around 400 watts. So I'll do a bunch of like intermediate climbs where I'm pushing the pace and I'm breathing hard. And I would target being tired at the end of the ride, but not totally destroyed like I would if I was trying to be in peak shape in like May or something like that. But maybe I just do a few of those efforts and the total time of intensity is like 30 or 40 minutes early on. But by the time, January or February rolling around, usually each week I would have 2 or 3 rides that are a couple hours long, one ride that was maybe 3 to 4 hours, and a couple of rides that were like 4 to 6 hours long. And so like my favorite long ride that I would try to do some version of every week later in my career when I was racing professionally would be to incorporate Morgan Territory and Diablo or Palomares and Diablo. So it would be like 90 to 105, 110 sometimes miles. And I would include like 2 long climbing efforts that would be like 25 to 30 minutes. And by that point, I would be doing like right around threshold. And sometimes I would do the summit of Diablo. So like if the weather was nice in March and I'm getting ready for the Tour of California, like 2 months later, I might do like an hour and a half steady and then an hour, like 45 minutes up Diablo going like pretty hard, another hour and a half steady, and then another 20 minutes, like pretty full gas. And then late in the ride, like whatever energy I had left, I would just empty the tank. And so I would do like a ton of work that was all basically aerobic, and I wouldn't be doing a bunch of attack efforts and VO2 max efforts like I might be doing later in the season. But I would just have a slow and steady progression, like building up the quantity of total work done at higher aerobic intensities on the harder days, coupled with some like big gear work, some easier rides, and some strength work off the bike. And I think that a lot of people shy away from doing high aerobic work, but especially if you're on a tighter schedule, like you really have to. Like you can't just do 10 hours of easy riding and benefit much from it. Like maybe in the first couple of weeks when you're picking up your training again, but after 2, 3, 4 weeks, like you need to start doing some stuff that's more challenging. And even just because you're not doing like all out sprint efforts doesn't mean your training can't be like quite challenging.
All right. So for people that can't ride at 400 watts for 30 to 45 minutes up Mount Diablo, although it takes me a lot longer to get to the top of Mount Diablo than those kinds of times. What do you recommend for someone whose threshold is perhaps half of that and has like half the time in the winter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the same principle would still apply. So it's really useful to, like, if you have access to a gym or you have some equipment at home, make use of that a couple times a week, because between like November and March, let's say, you want to finish your winter preparation with as much endurance and as much strength and power as you can have, like muscular power. So like your ability to lift weights or like push a big gear and generate a lot of force. And you want to have like pretty good cardiac efficiency so that your sub-threshold intensities feel comfortable. So that way you can pile on like higher intensity stuff when you're working on that. So if you're doing that on a shorter schedule, it probably just means that you take a look at how much time you have available to train and pick which days might look like they're good for doing intensity. So you might have more time on the weekends, and it's fine to load up a lot of training on the weekends and do like 3 or 4 hours on Saturday and then 2 or 3 hours on Sunday. Or if you just have 3 hours, like do 3 hours on Saturday and 2 hours on Sunday. And then probably like Monday off, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday could be some kind of quality training. Like maybe you do Tuesday, Thursday harder. But on your harder days, focus on doing like big gear work where you could do, let's say, 90% of threshold at 60 to 75 RPM to build up muscular strength and also get good aerobic conditioning. And that type of work can be done on the trainer in an hour if you're really constrained, or it can be done like in an hour and a half before it gets dark after work, or before work. And you really want to make sure that you're getting the most stress that you can handle into the time that you have allotted. So if you just have an hour to train, like think about how you can get the most like sub-threshold aerobic stress without like totally roasting yourself. So you want to like create a stress where you feel worked, like you feel like you got to work out. Like if you're training and you don't ever feel tired, like that's not really stressing your body in a way that's going to help drive your fitness forward. But you also don't want to finish like, I don't know. I imagine people going to like a spin class or a CrossFit type workout where it's just like it's arbitrary, it's just random elements, and it's just like really hard, and you finish and you feel like you had a sense of accomplishment, but you're not necessarily driving towards anything. You're just doing like random stuff. So doing like random hard workouts that you find online that are not specific to whatever your goals are won't necessarily be the most effective. But like working on like strength, aerobic conditioning, and making the workouts hard enough that you feel like you got to work out, but that you can recover and a day or two later do it again is pretty ideal. So you can do that with 3 or 4 hours of training during the week and then 5 hours on the weekend, which is, a pretty average thing. A lot of my athletes have a schedule that's like that.
So what my takeaway from that is like, you need to still go hard in the winter. As much as I'd like to just kind of ride around slow and maybe have a snack and a coffee here and there, that's not really going to help you achieve your goals. Like it's almost like it's almost misrepresented that you should just like ride easy and do base in the winter. Like you actually need to go out there and give it your all, but you're just not killing yourself like the way I would in a race in the summer.
You're mostly just staying away from those like white hot intensities. And like we touched on last week, if you're training mostly steady for like 30 hours, like that's really hard, but most of us aren't doing that. So we can't just take whatever like Shroom is doing or Michelanda or whoever and just like shrink it down to 8 hours. Like 8 hours of easy training is overall pretty easy. 30 hours of not that hard training is really hard.
Yeah. So do you think people should work on or do any kind of sprinting in the winter? That's another like thing that people talk about. Would you incorporate that into this type of training or?
Yeah, I definitely would. I wouldn't do it in the same way. So like if you're doing sprint training, if you're doing, let's say, as hard as you can for like 20 or 30 seconds, that's going to create a huge anaerobic load, and you're going to completely use up the kind of latent ATP that you have just like sitting in your muscles. Like if you're rolling down a hill and then there's like a little punchy climb and you're like soft pedaling going into it, you have probably like 5 to 10 seconds of ATP that's just at the ready. Like you can pedal and there's not really any real like metabolic consequences for it. After that, you really start digging into your creatine phosphate energy system and you create a lot of anaerobic load on your body as you unload your phosphate groups from your creatine phosphate molecules, and you start doing anaerobic glycolysis. So you create a lot of lactate over the course of 30 seconds. Like you can do a lot of anaerobic damage. But if you do that for 5 or 10 seconds, it's kind of just like a free bit of energy that you have that you can still practice those high power efforts, and you can still train your neuromuscular system to have high force production and coordination to smoothly and powerfully execute a sprint. So I will often incorporate that into my training and my athletes training, where I'll do like short punchy accelerations that are like 8 to 10 seconds long, but not longer than that. Or like maybe seated accelerations that are not all out, but they're more like a weight training type of activity where you just like sit in the saddle and you just throw down like 20 or 30 seconds of hard acceleration, but you stop before you feel your legs really loading up. So you can like, that's one thing, like you don't need to overthink how much power you're doing or how you're doing it, but you can like really stomp on the pedals, but just ease up before it starts to hurt. It's that extra like 5 to 10 seconds where you really start to like bleed out of your eyes. That's what you would want to be doing when you're getting in peak shape, but you can still do like the first 2/3 of that effort and get a lot of neuromuscular benefit out of it that will like set you up for being better down the road.
How do you think people think about the progression in their training in winter? And let's start with like, we're going into December now, right? We're at the end of November. How would you suggest that people think about, let's say, the next 3 months? Was what I think people here in Northern California, where the racing steam starts a little bit earlier. Obviously, in other parts of the country or in Canada, where it's a little bit colder, they maybe got 5 or 6 months. Maybe I'm being a bit optimistic, but what do you think the progression looks like? Like, is there a thing that you should start with, like dead of winter, maybe do more weight training, or then do some more miles? Like, I just like, how would you kind of like arrange that?
Yeah. So I would, whatever the circumstances, I would just think about like, where am I right now and where do I want to be in a few months or in several months, and what can I do to like set myself up for that? And sometimes there might be intermediate steps. So like, I don't know, right now I'm active and I'm like not doing heavy weight training, but I want to be, and I can go out and do a long ride, but I'm not doing really high intensity riding, let's say. Like, I'll think about like, how can I kind of nudge my fitness forward in the areas that are going to be beneficial to me and where I know I can make gains. So if you aren't strength training and you're starting to, just start off easy. Spend like 3 or 4 weeks just doing the moves, just getting a little bit stronger, but not pushing hard, so that you have some like basic strength so that you can push hard in like a month or two, and then just slowly but steadily build up that. Same thing, like if you took time off, don't start by like trying to jump back into whatever your normal long ride is. Like if you normally do 4 or 5 hour rides on the weekends, but you haven't done that for a month, just go out and do like 3 hours on the weekend. That's probably going to be challenging. And then do 3.5, and then do 4, and then do 4.5 over the next like month, and just slowly but steadily build up. But think about where you want to be in a few months, and what kinds of workouts can work on the fitness areas that you want to see improvement in. And I would also kind of add that sometimes people identify their weaknesses as something that they really want to work on. It's like, oh, like I'm a terrible sprinter. Like anyone that has raced with me knows that I'm like the guy to bet on to like lose the sprint. So I always have to like attack early, or be away solo or something like that. But over the years, like I've been tempted to work on my sprint more, and I definitely found that doing strength work helped me a lot with that. The nice thing about strength work for me, at least, was that I don't naturally have really high neurological recruitment. So strength work helped me for my high end power, but it also helped me to have like better sustained power for like time trialing and like seated climbing efforts. But if I went really deep on working on my sprint, like it's going to go from terrible to kind of bad. And it's like, I don't have a lot of room to really get good at it. So putting a lot of work in there and giving up all of my ability to train on my aerobic systems is really going to be a bad choice for me. Whereas maybe I'm in good aerobic shape now, but I could be in great aerobic shape, and I can do a lot of work to like progress in that area. And that's going to help me to, get good results. So you just want to think about like what you want to be working on, what's challenging for you now, and just keep nudging it up so that you're always doing something that's challenging but manageable. And it's really only in that last like 1 to 2 months before you want to be in peak shape that you really want to just like bury yourself in workouts.
Got it. So based on that advice, I'm going to practice stuffing as many water bottles as I can in the back of my jersey, because that's probably the only job I could possibly manage in professional cycling. So on actually a more serious note, like, so people who like don't know, like, if they're a good climber or a good sprinter, they kind of ride around a lot. They like riding. They probably like climbing, particularly here and where we live, right? There's some beautiful climbs. You can mention Morgan Territory or Mount Diablo, which if you don't know about those, you should definitely go and take a look. They'll come right up on Strava. They're some of the best climbs for cyclists, probably in North America. What do you recommend for those people? So I guess if we're talking about those type of people, like sprinting is probably not something that they need to be great at, although like having some ability to accelerate is always valuable when they get dropped from whatever group ride they like to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually for a lot of people, they even just want to be like doing centuries or like fast group rides, and they have no aspirations to race. I think that doing sprint work and doing short, intense interval work sometimes it can be really valuable, because most people that don't ever do that are the ones that struggle with changes in pace in a group ride, or they struggle when the gradient changes. And people naturally will just like push harder when they're going up the climb, if it's just like a rolling kind of thing. And people that don't practice doing efforts that are like twice their threshold for short periods of time really find that challenging. And even if your only goal was to just ride long rides and feel strong doing it, doing those really short intense efforts sometimes will make you feel much better at those more sustained efforts, like doing a century ride or something like that. But as far as like specialization and knowing your strengths and weaknesses, I think that a lot of people kind of confuse what their current training status is or where they live with their strengths and weaknesses. So like in the Bay, obviously we both know there's like a bunch of 5 to 10 minute climbs like everywhere. And there's almost no extended flat riding unless you kind of like seek it out. And most of that flat riding is interrupted with like stop signs and stoplights and stuff like that. So there's not really like um, opportunities to train. Like your opportunities to train are kind of like constrained by the place that you live. And if you just do certain types of riding, like if you just ride through the hills all the time, you'll probably be pretty good at 5 to 10 minute power relative to your sprint power or relative to your like hour long power. Whereas somebody that lives somewhere else might have a different power profile. I would not assume that you have certain strengths and weaknesses until you've at least worked kind of in a balanced fashion for a while. So usually for like the high schoolers that I work with or newer clients that I work with, I'll usually have pretty balanced training that doesn't go too heavy on sprinting or like threshold power. I'll include work that's kind of a little bit across the board to allow those systems to develop over time so that we can see with good training whether or not somebody actually has a good sprint, or they just happen to have a better sprint than they had for a longer time because they just did sprints on their group rides with their buddies and they just did like a bunch of town line sprints, because if you do that, you'll have a good sprint because that's like the only hard training you do is you just ride around and you do like a dozen town line sprints every Saturday. But if you mix in some like threshold work, maybe you actually find out that you're a decent climber. So usually I would give it a couple of years of like pretty balanced training where you're working on everything. And working on everything like is never a bad idea. It's just a bad idea to focus your training on something that's not actually your strength or not actually going to get you the results that you want.
Yeah, no, I think that's good advice. And your point about like where people live and what the terrain is around them is well taken, right? If you go down to San Diego, another place where cycling is really popular in the United States, they mostly have these incredibly fast, flat rides like that I had never seen in the Bay Area at all. It was like a completely different type of cycling and totally different approach. And then when there were a few hills, they would just ride up really slow. I was really surprised. We're like, here, every hill that's the race, right? Like people race up the hill as fast as they can in the Bay Area. And if you're not great at it, like I'm not fantastic at that type of riding. I'm always like just struggling to keep up. And then in other areas, like they work on other types of stuff, right? We're like in, a flatter place, like, I tend to be a bigger, stronger guy and I can kind of like pedal pretty hard. And so I'm not held back by power to weight like people are with some of the big climbs here, right? Why don't we switch gears and talk a little bit more about winter training and like nutrition, recovery? Like, should people approach that differently than when they do it in the summer? Like, if you're changing your training program, like you're going to incorporate more weight training, you're going to do these shorter sprints, not the longer sprints. Like, what do people make adjustments in their nutrition and their recovery? Like, is there things that they could do to optimize that stuff and incorporate it with what they're doing now?
Yeah, so I think for the most part, most of the general principles would remain the same, but depending on what it is that you're doing, you might modulate certain things. So I think the key things that you would think about doing is if you have taken a break and you're getting back into training, or if you're adding types of training that you're not used to because you don't do it during the season. So if you add some running, if you add some skiing or like snowshoeing, if you live someplace where it's cold, or if you add some weight training, like don't assume that your body is going to love every minute of it. And I would include a little bit more like stretching and rolling and like body work so that you can hopefully maintain that new training modality until you have gotten much more comfortable at it. So a lot of times, like, you might be more sore, you might be more stiff after going to the gym or going running. So just be cognizant of that and ease into it. Um, no matter what kind of training you're doing, if it's hard, you want to make sure you're sleeping well. And I think that a lot of the things that we do when it's really intense in May, like, you're just so tired that you sleep well no matter what. But a lot of times, like, you don't want to ease up on your practices about like eating well and sleeping well throughout the year. I think the biggest thing nutrition wise that is worth kind of noting is no matter what kind of training we're doing, it's useful to have adequate protein available in our recovery meals. So in the first hour or two after training, even if it's not very intense, um, but it was like maybe long and steady, or you went to the gym and it wasn't that calorie demanding, but it was like a challenging workout, you still want to have protein available so that you can build up, new structural proteins and new enzymes so that you can burn fuel at higher rates. And that's like largely what allows us to get fitter, is that we produce new enzymes so we can burn fuel. But that I would regard as being pretty steady. I would modulate carbohydrate intake. So if you're not doing high quantities of high intensity work like you would be when you're racing, or you're doing VO2 max intervals or threshold intervals later in the year, you don't burn through as much carbohydrate as you do at those times. So if you're riding mostly steady and you're doing mostly sub-threshold work, you're gonna tend to burn a little bit of a different mix of fuel. And the biggest variable in that is muscle glycogen. So even if it's just like a 5 or 10% difference, you might not need an extremely high carbohydrate diet in the winter. Depending on what your goals are, that might even be one opportunity for people that are on a tighter schedule. If they're trying to build endurance but they can't ride really long rides, they might proactively slowly but surely diminish the amount of carbohydrate that they eat at certain times so that they can train without totally full glycogen stores all the time. That's maybe like a little bit more advanced topic, but basically, like, if you're training 10 hours a week throughout the year, but in May you're doing really hard intervals, you're going to need more carbohydrate for that, because every second that you're doing VO2 max intervals, you're burning all carbohydrate. Whereas if you're riding steady or you're riding tempo in the winter, you're burning a little bit more fat and a little bit less carbohydrate, and most of that carbohydrate drop comes from glycogen. So you just don't need to go crazy on carbs in the winter in the same way. And luckily for us, like, we're pretty healthy, we're active, we're exercising, so we're going to be generally be pretty insulin sensitive. But there is a seasonal trend that humans and most mammals get more insulin resistant in the wintertime as like a kind of evolutionary feature of our biology. So we tend to be better at storing fat in the winter, like, slightly. So having excess carbohydrate is probably not desirable for that as well.
Well, yeah, with all the holiday dinners and Thanksgiving, right? It's hard to avoid. So yeah, get lots of sleep. That makes lots of sense. I would try to focus on that year round, and then reducing carbs if possible, even if it's Thanksgiving. Well, I'll give it a shot. And then of
I
course,
mean,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, I mean, it's fine to like have fun at the holidays, but I think just like your baseline, maybe in the middle of summer and you're training and racing, maybe 65% carbs makes sense. In the winter, maybe just 50% carbs make sense, because you're just not doing all those really intense efforts. And then whatever, like a couple of weekends here and there, like if you do something that's way outside the norm, it's not a big deal. If what you're doing 90% of the time is effective, the 10% of the time where you like are doing something else, it's not a big deal. And adding to the sleep, more sleep is always better. Like, people just don't get enough sleep in general. But even if you can't get more sleep because you just have a certain schedule, the more regularly that you can sleep, like if you can go to bed and wake up at the exact same time or close to it, it helps to reinforce the circadian rhythms that we have and increases the effectiveness of our like hormone distribution throughout the day. So like, especially for an athlete who's sleeping and recovering, the spike in growth hormone that we get when we go to sleep is more effective if our sleep schedule is regular, even if you're not sleeping as much as you might, want to be sleeping.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. So my interpretation, I'm only going to have one slice of pie at Thanksgiving this year. Well, hey, to close us out, like, are there any things you want to recommend people like really avoid in winter training, and maybe specifically compared to things that they might do in summer training, right? What are those things that you want to likely look out for?
I feel like Well, the biggest thing to avoid would just be to do nothing but coffee shop rides all winter and just like, just ride steady and easy and not get any kind of quality training in. But if you think about like the really easy days and the really intense days that you do during like your peak time of year, just think about compressing that. Like your easy days don't need to be so easy that they're like just soft pedaling, and your hard days shouldn't be like white hot intensity. Just compress everything so your baseline is like pretty steady, you're getting conditioning in, and then your hard days are like hard enough that you feel like you got to work out, but you're not ever destroying yourself. And because those workouts are not quite as white hot intense, you can probably maybe do like 3 or 4 days of moderate intensity workouts instead of just 2 really high intensity day workouts. And if you are at a level where you're planning like harder blocks of training and recovery weeks, you probably need less frequent recovery weeks this time of year, because you can do like a long, slow and steady build for like a month, 4 or 5 weeks, and then take like an easy week. Instead of in April, you're doing races every weekend, you might need an easy week every 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, my fantasy just take some time off and just ride around from bakery to bakery, like listening to podcasts all across Northern California. It sounds fantastic to me. Well, hey, if you like this content, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and then of course, like leave comments, send us your training questions, find us both on social media, and we'll keep bringing you some great content. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.